Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and over the next 2 hours, going to cover a lot of different topics, as you might imagine. First of all, of course, we have the announcement that will be coming that indeed Stephen Breyer is stepping down. We'll talk about that in just a minute, because he did not make the announcement. The announcement was made for him. It was leaked, and there are some issues behind that, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Our first article, very good piece that kind of reminds us of what this might mean for the court. And, of course, we'll talk about that tomorrow with our good friend Kelly Shackelford. He and Penedexter will be with us for our weekend roundtable. But I'll also maybe talk briefly, not talk for too long, but about a couple of the potential nominees, who they are, why one might be better than another, and just a few things that we'll certainly be talking about for quite some time. And then at the bottom of this hour, we're going to be talking with Steve Green. And of course, he is the president of Hobby Lobby, also one of the co-founders of the Museum of the Bible. We'll talk with him about the Museum of the Bible, but more recently, Jordan Peterson, who we quote quite often here on Point of View. I've read many of his books, a psychologist, an individual that oftentimes writes about various aspects of religion and faith and spirituality and the rest. Anyway, got a tour of the Museum of the Bible, and until we had published this article, which I appreciate the fact that we just were able to publish, his daughter has come to faith through what she calls a sudden conversion, so we'll talk about some of that, which I think you will find very helpful. Next hour, we're going to bring Chelsey here. She'll just be joining us by phone. We're going to talk about the March for Life. Andrew posted a very good piece, 61 of the best signs from March for Life. And it is interesting not only to look at those signs, but to look at those young faces and to say, I think that's the future of the pro-life movement. And so we'll get into those issues as well. Either this hour or next hour, when I have a little more free time, we'll talk about Ukraine and Taiwan. Very good piece by Newt Gingrich to gives us some back history and kind of 4 key points I want to talk about. And then looking again at the election, because there is a piece that we have by Byron York about the impact that some of this might have on the election. And I think also explaining why, even though it is more traditional for a Supreme Court justice to announce that he or she is stepping down at the end of the Supreme Court term. Why did that happen now? Well, because the clock would be ticking back in June, and if indeed the midterms go the way we suspect they will, it would be much more difficult to confirm one of these nominees. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of what we will cover over these 2 hours. And if we don't get to any of those materials or all of those materials, there's always our Friday weekend edition. I got a feeling Kelly Shackelford is going to take quite a while here, because he has decisions that are coming down. One about our bakers in Oregon. That's an interesting one. One about, of course, Joe Kennedy, Coach Joe, in terms of that going to the Supreme Court. Also, what is happening right now with one of their other court cases that's before the Supreme Court on the issue of school choice, and a couple of other smaller cases we really haven't even talked about. So it's going to probably be busy. Plus, I'm sure he's going to weigh in with a few comments at least about this whole issue of the Supreme Court. But our first article comes from the editors of National Review. And first of all, they wish Stephen Breyer well. He is an individual that is 83, spent 27 years on the court, was brought onto the court by, at that time, President Bill Clinton. And they said, we wish we could be equally cheery about this prospect that his replacement will be faithful to the Constitution and the laws of the United States. And we certainly understand that he has represented a liberal wing of the Supreme Court, although somewhat more of a moderate compared to the other two in that category. But again, one of the things that the editors say is that President Biden has unwisely limited his options by preemptively declaring during the 2020 campaign that his first Supreme Court nominee would be a black woman. In a stroke, he disqualified dozens of liberal and progressive jurists for no other reason than their race and gender. This is not a great start in selecting someone sworn to provide equal justice under the law. Also, can I at least add that any individual that is selected will just, in some respects, always be tagged with the fact that you were selected simply because you were a black woman. It doesn't matter whether you bring a great deal of expertise to the conversation. It's back to the questions that people have had in the past. They used to talk about tokenism. That phrase is hardly ever used anymore. It's kind of archaic, but even an affirmative action hire and other things. And I feel sorry for who ends up on the court, whoever I assume she will be, unless it's transgender, then a he now she will be. I mean, I know we're getting a little bit off track here, but it's the kind of issue that makes you say it's not fair to the process. It's not fair to the person that ends up being selected and going through the confirmation process. But then the editors remind us of something else, which just occurred to me as I read the article, and that is President Biden is going to have a much more difficult time making the case for this individual because unlike Donald Trump, who gave us a list of potential candidates, we already knew who we was thinking of picking, we don't have anything like that here. We just heard the word black woman. In just a minute, after the break, I'll give you a list of some possibles and a little bit about them, but that is certainly the case. And so, again, even if Democrats remain united to provide the votes to confirm a nominee, Republicans still could extract, they say, a political cost in the midterm Senate races. And you do need 51%. Some people said, oh, it could be 50-50, and then Kamala Harris would cast the deciding vote. No, that's not the case. Shannon Bream was on a program just the other day. Matter of fact, we're hoping we will be able to interview Shannon Bream. She will be at National Bridges Broadcasters in March, so we can interview her there. But she was pointing out, of course, the precedent has always been that you need 51 votes. And so you've got to at least get one or two Republicans. I will point out that in many cases, some of these nominees, when they were put on like the appeals court, they got all of 3 Republican votes. Will they get the same number this time? They would need them because you'd have to hope that all the Democrats would stay in line in that regard. And so they also point out that one of the reasons there was an attempt to sort of move Justice Breyer off, Stephen Breyer off, is because in many cases, conservatives, as this article says, got real nervous and always get nervous about a Republican nominee. Democrats really haven't sent anybody who would be even a little bit less liberal since really Byron White was appointed by John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. And we also need to remind ourselves that President Bill Clinton actually sold Stephen Breyer as a moderate, mostly on the grounds that he would not try to impose any kind of knee-jerk reaction to the death penalty. But we know that even though he occasionally has voted with the conservative wing, rarely, in most cases, he's been a reliable vote for abortion, for same-sex marriage, and for, as they said, almost every other liberal and progressive social cause out there. So whoever will come onto the court might be a little bit more liberal, but we'll see. But it illustrates again, as I've said on this program many times before, you just can't be liberal enough. There are various liberal progressive organizations that have been pushing Stephen Breyer to step down because they want to put somebody in there who's even more ideologically committed than he is. And yet you're really hard put to find too many times when he voted in a way that really mattered on a major issue in a way that wouldn't be considered liberal and progressive. Anyway, let's take a break. I'm going to talk briefly about some of these nominees and what that might mean during the whole process right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In previous commentaries, I've quoted Dennis Prager's assessment that the left ruins just about every part of society it touches. The latest example comes from an editorial by Derek Hunter of how political correctness is ruining the film industry. The example he cited was the decision by Hollywood to make a movie about the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The producers were able to secure Helen Mirren to play the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. This was a key component to the project since there might not be much interest in this story with the public, but getting Mirren on the project will probably increase interest and put more people in movie seats. There's just one problem. Helen Mirren isn't Jewish. For most of us, having a person who isn't Jewish play a Jewish person isn't a problem. As one of the guests on my radio program put it, it's called acting. In his commentary, Derek Hunter reminds us of another controversy in Hollywood. That one surfaced when it was announced that Scarlett Johansson would be playing a trans person in an upcoming movie. When the criticism came from the trans community, she dropped out of the project and the movie was scrapped. The publicity image for the film showed Helen Mirren in prosthetics that made her look like the Israeli politician. Derek Hunter then asked, are prosthetics not allowed anymore? Should Gary Oldman not have played Winston Churchill because he's not bald and obese? This led to an interesting discussion on my radio program about what would no longer be allowed in Hollywood. Perhaps the funniest line was that if you use the latest politically correct criteria, then Leonard Nimoy couldn't even be allowed to play Spock in Star Trek because he wasn't a Vulcan. I guess we need to laugh because the reality of all this is so tragic. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, in the bottom of the hour, we're going to be talking with Steve Green, president of Hobby Lobby, as well as one of the co-founders of the Museum of the Bible. But before we do that, let me mention just a couple of other issues. One of those, of course, has to do with the various nominees. And I know it's very early to talk about who will replace Justice Stephen Breyer, but a couple of names have surfaced. First of all, let me dismiss one. I jokingly yesterday said Kamala Harris. There is really no reason to believe that Kamala Harris will be appointed for a lot of different reasons. First of all, if you are the vice president, you may be looking eventually to become the president of the United States. So nothing that is going to dissuade you from that is going to be helpful. And becoming a Supreme Court justice for life, I think, would derail that possibility. So first of all, emotionally, she probably would not want to do it. Legally, there are some better candidates that would be much easier to justify than that. Also, you run into then a series of dominoes that have to fall, because then all of a sudden the Biden administration would have to not only begin a nomination process and a confirmation process for one of these other nominees, but then have to also at the same time, if indeed this individual was going to be selected, look for someone who would be the vice presidential replacement. We've been through this once before with Nelson Rockefeller back in the 1970s, but it's a long and tedious process as well. And of course, it would prevent the possibility of the vice president, that would be Kamala Harris, casting a possible vote if there's a 50-50 tie in the United States Senate. We can go through all the other reasons why this doesn't make sense, but those are reasons enough to set those aside. Okay, then who might you recommend, or who do you think is the odds-on favorite? Here's my recommendation. I don't have any inside knowledge, don't necessarily believe that there couldn't be someone else that nobody's talking about, but Ketanji Brown Jackson, I think, is the logical front runner. You might say, okay, who is she? Well, she actually is on the circuit court in the District of Columbia. The D.C. Circuit Court is oftentimes seen as the farm team for the Supreme Court, using a baseball analogy that we all love here. She would have an easy move from the D.C. Circuit to the Supreme Court. She is obviously a woman, obviously black, and this is where it would be unfair to her, because though I would have to say that a lot of us sitting around this table would disagree with many of the things that she has ruled on. Matter of fact, she's been overturned unanimously many times. It's just amazing. But nevertheless, that's not the point. I mean, she does bring at least some level of scholarship, and we may disagree with that, may disagree with her perspective, but the bottom line is, I think in some respects, if she does get selected, she'll always be seen as the token, or as the individual that was an affirmative action hire, rather than based on some of her beliefs. Now, by the way, I'm not minimizing the fact that when some of her decisions have ended up on places like the Supreme Court, they've been set aside. So that could be a problem. In her favor is that she was, in one of her rulings, if I remember right, claimed and really said some really strong things about former President Donald Trump, saying, you may be the president, but you're not the king, and those kinds of things. So in some respects, she could be also the odds-on favorite for all the anti-Trumpers out there, as well as individuals that are actually looking for a much more, maybe even strident, liberal, progressive justice on the court. So that's one possibility. Let me mention one other, and that is Kristen Clark. Again, you might say, who's she? Well, she's the Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. So again, moving from the Justice Department to the Supreme Court would make some sense if indeed we see and believe that indeed this is exactly what President Biden is going to do, that he is actually still very much committed to a black woman. I think it would be very hard for him now to walk that back. And so that, I think, gives you at least two of the nominees. Of course, there have been some others that have been mentioned, some of whom don't have the kind of legal experience that would be the case. So there you go. By the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But, okay, the last time, interestingly enough, a liberal was appointed to the Supreme Court was under Barack Obama, and that was in 2010, and that was Elena Kagan. Now, you might remember, matter of fact, Kelly Shackelford and her sometimes interacted because she was the Solicitor General at the time, and sometimes they even sat next to each other when there would be oral arguments in the Supreme Court. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but it's kind of interesting. And in that case, you had 5 Republican judges voted for her. So it isn't necessarily the case that you always have to get 51. In this case, you got more than that. But let's go back to Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. When she was actually voted onto the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, you only had 3 Republicans vote for her. We now have a lot of her opinions, and it might be more possible that some of the Republicans who were content to put her on the D.C. Circuit might not be as comfortable putting her on the Supreme Court for life. So that's something to think about there as well. But again, the last time we had an attempt by Barack Obama to put somebody on the court, you might, of course, remember that was a situation in which we had Merrick Garland, in which Mitch McConnell basically decided after Justice Antonin Antonin Scalia died, not to actually fill that position and then allow it to be filled by the winner of the 2016 presidential race, which ended up being, surprisingly for some people, Donald Trump, and ended up not being Merrick Garland. And I still think that works pretty well. But here is one of the other very important issues, and that is we learned a little bit more about Merrick Garland, who was presented as a moderate, and you might remember him is the Attorney General who ordered the FBI to begin to look into these parents that were showing up at school boards, and we've talked about that before. But since some calls are coming in, let me take this one just before we take a break, and we'll go to South Carolina to Sue. And Sue, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, I love it every day, every day. My question...
We lost her right then. I know what her question was, and that is, since the Justice Breyer has not actually resigned officially, although I think that'll probably happen today or soon, could he just say, wait a minute, the announcement of my retirement is premature? So it is certainly a theoretical possibility, and certainly even if he announces his retirement now, bottom line is pretty simple, and that is the reality that he's already sort of seen some of the wheels in motion. But at least that's a possibility. I think we've got Sue back here as well. Sue, you back with me?
Yes, sir, I am. I'm not sure if you heard my question. My question is, since it was announced by someone else, leaked out, whatever, would it be something if Justice Breyer came forward and said, hey, fake news, I'm not retiring? I mean, could they force him out? Or,
nope.
I mean, he has not come forward and actually said, I'm going to retire.
Right.
Or when he was going to retire. So are we like frothing up the big, coffee cup here and with a lot of foam and poof, it's going to flatten out because he chooses not to retire?
I think you got a very good point. And the point is, of course, he probably will. But I do go back to some of the things that Shannon Bream, since she's kind of got the inside track, she was talking to people that were saying things like, well, he was disappointed, he was bewildered, he was blindsided, and all the rest. So, it's quite possible. I would hope that it would happen because it would illustrate again that this attempt sometimes to force somebody out doesn't always work, and you cannot remove an individual from the Supreme Court unless you impeach that individual, and it's very difficult to ever consider how that would take place. So I think you've brought a really good point, and I would, just from a talk show point of view, love to have that happen because then we get into the intricacies of all of this. But I have heard that it's quite likely that he is going to announce his retirement, but it was announced for him, and I think it was very unfair to him. I think it's also very unfair to whoever is nominated because, as I assume it's going to be as she goes through the confirmation process, always in the ether, maybe even a cloud over your head, is going to be this idea that, well, you were only selected because of your skin color, not because of your legal justice and your legal acumen and your legal scholarship and the rest, that you are actually simply there to represent a viewpoint. And of course, we know that there would be a consistent vote from that individual that would always be liberal progressive. And that, of course, is not good for the future of this country, but it's the reality which we face ourselves with. Anyway, let's take a break. When we come back, Steve Green is going to be with us, president of Hobby Lobby, also the co-founder of the Museum of the Bible. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and we have all sorts of information about that you might want to read. It's on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention, we were talking just a minute ago with Sue about the possibility that Breyer, for example, might change his mind, which he could. Of course, he has announced that he is stepping down, but, you know, it's not within the realm, certainly within the most distant realm of possibility that if you see the nominee that you don't like and say, wait a minute, I've changed my mind, I'm going to stay around for another year or two. That's not going to happen, but it is at least theoretically possible to talk about what would happen. And the answer is nothing, because you cannot remove a Supreme Court justice unless you impeach the individual and remove him or her from office. So nevertheless, it's pretty obvious now as you start going out on the internet, as I just did in the break, to see how many articles are starting to surface about Ketanji Brown Jackson, and there are a lot of those. Harvard law graduate, part of the, if you will, inner circle with the D.C. Circuit Court, certainly kind of the odds-on favorite, and we'll continue to follow that and maybe get some more perspective from Kelly Shackelford tomorrow when he joins our weekend edition. Let's, if we can, now go to our good friend Steve Green. He is the president of Hobby Lobby. He, along with his wife, are the co-founders of the Museum of the Bible. We've posted a very good article that mentions Jordan Peterson getting a tour through the Museum of the Bible, some of the things that he said as well, and also is the author of the book, This Beautiful Book, an exploration of the Bible's incredible storyline and why it matters today, published by Zondervan. We've talked with him before. We've also had his father, David Green, in studio with us. And so, Steve, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great being with you again, and looking forward to it.
Well, let's, if we can, remind people about the Museum of the Bible. I tell people that if they ever have a chance to make their way to Washington, D.C., of course, they want to go to the Capitol, and they want to see if they can get a tour of the White House, and want to go to the Smithsonian. But please make sure that you allocate not just a few hours, but at least a day to go through the Museum of the Bible, because there is so much more there that if you wanted to look at every exhibit, might actually take you pretty close to a week, wouldn't it?
It would, and we have many of our visitors that say that the visit to the museum exceeded their expectations. I kind of discount that because I say, I bet your expectations weren't real high going to a Bible museum. But when I have visitors that say, we brought our family, did all the D.C. things, the White House and Capitol and the monuments, but the favorite was Museum of the Bible, to me, that says something. And it would take days to really capture, as you say, all that's in the museum. And as I like saying, you really scratch the surface if you spend a day in the museum of a museum that scratches the surface of the Bible story, because there is no building that can contain this book's story. It's an incredible story, and we literally are only scratching its surface. What
I love is that there are so many different kinds of things. There's something that's basically like a ride, so the kids would love this. There's, if you've never been to Israel, give you a sense of what it would be like during the time of Jesus. You've got an event coming up in the future, a virtual tour of Qumran, because, of course, the whole issue of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the 75th anniversary of that, which you talked about just the other day, as well as just ongoing exhibits. And if you make your way to the museum, the first thing you need to do is get one of these devices and say, okay, here are the kinds of things I'm most interested in, so it can drive you to the places that you would have the greatest interest. Because, as I said, it's almost like overchoice when you first walk in that door. You're looking up and you're seeing some of the visuals, and you're seeing the store, and you're learning about all the different floors, and you go, okay, where do I get started? And so you've made it easier for people that show up to actually begin to have a more guided tour through the Museum of the Bible, don't you?
Exactly, and there is something for everybody, and so that helps you get a good starting point. You know, where do I even start? Because we have some great artifacts from the Israeli Antiquity Authority, the Vatican, our own artifacts, to, as you indicate, Disney-esque ride that makes it fun. We fly you through D.C., showing you where Scripture's engraved on monuments all over the city. So there's really something for everybody, and we made it so that everybody in the family can enjoy it and learn while they're going through the museum.
One of the things that plays off of your book, this beautiful book, is you have a whole exhibit on the history of the Bible. And that, I think, is helpful because a lot of what we talk about here, Steve, is apologetics. How do we defend the Christian faith? And I'm always amazed that people that have been reading the Bible for some time, maybe memorized whole sections of the Bible, when you begin to talk about how the Bible came together, they kind of look at you with a little bit of a puzzled look. And that's one of the reasons that you have that there. You actually get to see, in some cases, the manuscripts, or in some cases, the replica of the manuscripts, like, for example, the Isaiah scroll and things of that nature. But that's a very important teaching part, and really, I think, essential to an individual who is trying to talk about why the Bible is important to them and help answer some of the kinds of questions that people sometimes ask about the Bible if they're skeptics.
I was listening to a scholar from Cambridge, and he made a comment that the Bible is typically attacked in one of two ways. Is it true and is it good? Some argue it's a novel, it's made up, and it's not true, and others argue it's a scourge of the earth, created all of the wars, and we'd be better without it. Well, the Impact Floor, we're really taking a look as, is this book good, and show that it has been good in every area of life. The history floor, as you alluded to, is really the question is this book true? And while I can't show evidence for all of Scripture, what we can show you is that time and time again, the evidence has shown that the book is exactly what it claims to be, that it is accurately telling the history of the people of Israel, and the manuscript evidence is unlike anything else in antiquity. So the more we understand and the more we learn of its history, the more confidence we have in this book. I was just teaching on Daniel in my church on Sunday and showed a Nebuchadnezzar brick. Here's a brick, and there's many of them out there, from Nebuchadnezzar's constructions of palaces and really celebrating his efforts. And that brick would have been made when Daniel was in Babylon at that time, because he was there throughout the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And it just brings to life and makes it that much more real when we're reading Scripture, to realize that these are real events that we're reading about.
And I've said before that if you can't make it to Israel, then the next best, and it's really very close to the next best, is the Museum of the Bible, because you see so much there. But even if you've been to Israel, it really helps put some of the pieces together. And so, again, we have information about the Museum of the Bible. If you think you may be traveling there, there's a section in the midst of it there to plan your visit, and you can find out a little bit more about that. And even if you aren't there, you can see so much online that would be helpful. But one of the other articles we've posted, Steve, has to do with this particular event that took place when Jordan Peterson, who we've quoted from time to time, actually was just the other day on the podcast with Joe Rogan, but also you gave him a tour of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. This appeared in FaithWire, and it's about 2 pages if people want to read it, because I found it fascinating, because I've been following the writings of Jordan Peterson for some time. I have a number of his books on my shelf, and can point to various things that, even though he is not a Christian, even though he's not necessarily coming with a view of biblical orthodoxy, says a lot of very positive things about the Bible. And you gave him an opportunity to walk through the Museum of the Bible. How'd that go?
We did. It was just this last Friday. He and his wife were in town. His wife was flying in, and he was waiting for her at the airport. Her flight was delayed, so he came on out, and she joined us a little bit later. But it was a great opportunity to give him, again, a brief glimpse of the museum. He mentioned he was going to have to come back out for some other time, because we just didn't have time to go through all of it. And it was obviously he's an intriguing gentleman, very brilliant. I think I jokingly have said, I think I understand about half of what he said. But it was a great time. We were sitting in our theater and kind of brainstorming possibilities of him doing some lectures in there. He's getting ready to do a lecture on Exodus. I think he's worked through Genesis, as I understand, and
yes,
has hours on Genesis. And he talked about reading the first line of Genesis and then lecturing for 3 hours. So it would be interesting to see and hear what he has to say on Exodus. So it was a great opportunity to meet him, and we enjoyed the time. And then, yeah, he was on the Joe Rogan program, and we got a lot of people mentioned to us. He plugged the museum well, and we appreciate that.
That article is on our website right now. You can read it. When we come back, I want to mention something else about his daughter, which I thought was pretty fascinating. But also, let me open up the phones. Perhaps you have a comment or a question. Maybe you've been to the Museum of the Bible and like to talk about that, or maybe you have a question because you're thinking maybe you family might this summer or even during spring break want to go to Washington, D.C., want to know a little bit more. So let's open up the phones in case you have a question. If not, just sit back. We have a lot more to cover. 800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join us, we'll continue our conversation with Steve Green right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Steve Green with us. Let me just mention that the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with Chelsey about the March for Life, and then we'll get back to some of the issues in the news. So lots of things we're covering here today. And, of course, tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. Also, let me point you to this article in addition to a link to the Museum of the Bible, and I would really encourage you to go and look at it. Even if you can't make it to Washington, D.C., there's a lot that's available online that would really encourage your confirmation foundation into the historical accuracy of the Bible, that the Bible is true, and then the whole level there on the impact of the Bible, that the Bible is good. And even as we were talking about this the other day, more and more young people aren't necessarily asking the question, is the Bible true? They're asking, is the Bible good? Because they've heard all sorts of the so-called new atheist, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens when he was alive, and all sorts of other individuals talking about that. And of course, we had that conversation with Jim Dennison on Monday. So certainly look at some of the material that's there. But for just a minute, Steve, what was so interesting is in this article that is on FaithWire, Billy Holloway wrote it, in addition to maybe encouraging people to pray for Jordan Peterson, because I've been reading his books, I've watched a lot of his YouTube videos, even from the days when he was teaching the classroom. In the midst of this article, you have this story about his daughter who revealed back in October that she had come to faith during what she calls a very sudden conversion. And she said in one of these podcasts, I'm pretty new to this. What I've been doing for the past month is reading the Bible and praying. It's been like the amount of peace that I've hadn't had before. It's completely absurd. I can't believe it. So it, I think, again, illustrates that when we encourage people to get into the Bible, if we let the Bible do its work, we see some remarkable results. And I was heartened, since I, from time to time, have prayed for Jordan Peterson, since he says some things sometimes that remind me of comments that C.S. Lewis said before he became a Christian. I've wondered what might be happening in his heart and life, but this article goes into that in some detail, and I thought it was kind of interesting. We wanted to share it with our listeners today.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate his honesty. He alluded to the fact he mentioned, he made a comment to grab your attention. The Bible's not true, and then he goes on to say it's more than true. And the point he makes is it is foundational to much of Western culture when you dig down and see its influence. And so I appreciate the honesty, even though he may not have embraced its message at this point. I made a reference to Richard Dawkins myself when I was talking to him Friday. I said, Richard Dawkins also at least is honest enough to admit that the Bible has such an impact on our culture, it should be taught in our schools, and the purpose is for literary culture. He's arguing that because for us to be literate in our culture, we need to know the Bible. It's like if you listen to the news, you may hear somebody acting as a Good Samaritan. Well, if you don't know the Good Samaritan story, then you are, to a degree, illiterate in our culture. So even Richard Dawkins is honest enough to argue that we ought to be teaching this book, and I appreciate that about Jordan as well. And he's on a journey, and we pray, as you do, that he comes to accept the truth of Scripture.
I like what you said there, because you so often run into people that when you make a statement that's a biblical allusion, and we can think of so many examples, the pearl of great price and the Good Samaritan, and I mean the list is a very long set of those that you would assume most people would understand, and you could maybe a generation or two ago assume that, but you can't assume that anymore because of biblical illiteracy. And that's something else that I think that the Museum of the Bible provides. It may be even for your skeptics to walk through there, and I know that you do have some that walk through that aren't necessarily Bible-believing people walking through that museum. They've got to at the end say, there's a lot more here than I thought it was, and if I really want to be an educated person, I've maybe got to at least crack open a Bible. Maybe I can find one in my hotel room there, a Gideon Bible or something, because this has had a lot more influence, and if I really want to consider myself to be an educated person, I certainly need to know something about the Bible, and this level of Bible illiteracy is one of the reasons why you put together the Museum of the Bible in the first place.
It is, and we really even have the skeptic in mind as we were building it. On our history floor, where we're showing the evidence for the Bible, and it's addressing the question, is it true? We never say it's true. We just present the evidence and let the visitor decide. I think that the skeptic wants to know that we're not pushing an agenda, that we're going to be an honest presentation of the facts, and we will let the visitor make their own decision. Same thing on the impact floor, where we're looking to if the book is good. We want the visitor to realize it. I almost want them to feel cheated once they've walked through that and realize how that this book has had an impact in every area of life, and how come I have never heard this, and cause them to be intrigued enough that they have to learn it, as you said. There's a portion there that we have a screen that has a world map,
Yes.
and it is only looking at the YouVersion app and showing where people are engaging with the YouVersion app all over the world, and we have to slow it down because we can't keep up with it.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is, for the skeptic that thinks that nobody is reading this book anymore, for them to realize, no, this book is being engaged with all over the world, and I would venture to say there is not a close second to a book that is being engaged with as much as the Bible right now. And hopefully the skeptic, again, will be intrigued to say, well, I better know this book myself.
One of the other things we talk about so often here on the program is the issue of Bible translation, and I love that section where you have all the various parts of the Bible, and you will see certain ones that have been fully translated, others that are going to be translated, and sometimes it's fun to pull out and say, wow, they have one in this particular language, or this, and again, it's just it sort of gives you, if you will, a worldview in the most biblical sense of that, to realize how the Bible has made an impact in the world. And again, back to that issue of Bible literacy. This might sound self-promotion, but the February issue of Decision Magazine, I have an article on the whole issue of Bible illiteracy among the younger generation, because we've just done a very extensive survey of Generation Y and Generation Z. So this is why we need to teach about the Bible. And for those of you that are pastors or Sunday school teachers or others, you might even encourage people in your sphere of influence. It could be a Sunday school class, it could be your church, to consider at least going to the website, which is museumofthebible.org. There's a place where you can plan your visit. There are various events. You can learn more about it. You can even become a member and support that organization. So, Steve, thank you for putting together the Museum of the Bible. And I know you're a very busy man, but thank you for giving us a half an hour to talk about it.
Oh, you bet. My pleasure. It was a joy, Kerby, and I would love to do it again sometime.
Let me mention again the book that came out a while back. It's a Zondervan book, This Beautiful Book, an exploration of the Bible's incredible storyline and why it matters. Of course, all sorts of other very good books in that regard. And you might want to know a little bit more about this museum. And even if you can't attend, and I hope that you would, you will certainly be able to benefit from some of the links that we've provided there. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk with our friend Chelsey. Normally she's sitting in my chair, but today we're going to just talk with her about the March for Life. And Andrew put up a very good piece here, 61 of the best signs from the March for Life. I think you'll enjoy the signs, but you'll also notice something else, the number of young faces there in that March for Life, especially as we now spend some time talking about a Supreme Court decision on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Not to mention, I'm broadcasting today from Texas, where we already have a heartbeat law, not just a heartbeat bill, but a heartbeat law, which has increased the number of abortion-minded women going to some of these pregnancy resource centers because it is pretty difficult to get an abortion in the state of Texas, saving lives, and we'll talk more about that as well. Chelsey, be with us, and then we'll get back into some issues in the news. I, of course, am not going to ignore what's going on in Ukraine. We'll be covering that in the latter half of the next hour, and also a couple interesting announcements coming down the pike, which we will talk about. But let's take a break, and when we come back, March for Life with Chelsey Youman right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about the March for Life with our good friend Chelsey Youman, and then we will get back into some of the issues in the news, because we have quite a bit, some announcements about COVID, some announcements about what is happening in China. Of course, we'll be looking at Ukraine and much, much more. Chelsey, of course, is familiar to all of you because she is the state director in the state of Texas and national legislative advisor for the Human Coalition. Individual used to be with First Liberty, and of course now with Human Coalition, a graduate of Southern Methodist University Law School, and of course an individual that we call on from time to time to be the host of our Millennia Roundtable. So Chelsey, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Oh, it is always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kerby.
We hardly ever get to see each other anymore. One, because you're in Austin and I'm in Dallas, but two, because even if when you were in this area, you would be on when I was off. So I still follow you on Facebook. So that's been kind of helpful. But let's, if we can, one of the articles that we've posted here, Andrew put it up there, from the 49th Annual March for Life. And it has some of the best signs from the March for Life. And I would encourage people to look at that, because first of all, you have a photographer taking pictures of those signs. But as you go through that, and you may not want to print them out because it would take you about 40 pages to do so. Interestingly enough, very significant number of young faces. And that tells me that the future of the pro-life movement is very bright. What do you think?
It is very bright indeed. You know, the March for Life is something I'm so glad, Kerby, that you're talking about on Point of View today, because it's really hard to find a lot of the mainstream media outlets who will talk about it or cover it. And it might surprise you listeners to know over 100,000 people attended this year. The first year I went, it was about 180,000 people all descend to the National Mall and then walk down to the steps of the Supreme Court building. And just to see the masses and masses of people who came to march for unborn children and be a voice for the voiceless, it's really powerful. And most of the crowd is young, which I am always so impressed by.
Also, the fact that it's been going on for so long. I'm hoping that if we do have this 50th anniversary March for Life, it will be marching for life because Roe versus Wade has been overturned. We'll get to that in just a minute. But you think of any other protest, any other kind of march, any kind of demonstration, the longevity of the pro-life movement, quite frankly, is not what the abortion providers assumed. They assumed that once we got abortion legalized essentially in 1973, maybe even further institutionalized with the Casey versus Planned Parenthood and some of that the youngest generation growing up hearing about abortion would assume that abortion is just one of those rights and that the whole pro-life movement would fade away. And actually, it's gone just the other way, because the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life. Isn't that true?
That's true. If anything, the pro-life movement has only gotten larger, better organized, and truthfully better at serving women and understanding the needs of why women are seeking abortion. One thing that may surprise you is there are 2,700 pregnancy resource centers in the country. They outnumber Planned Parenthood's 4 to 1. And these are pregnancy resource centers that meet women where they're at, provide more comprehensive care, better solutions. And so the movement is a really big movement. It's a really powerful movement, and certainly it's grown over time. One of the reasons I think that younger generations are more pro-life than they've ever been is just because we have the benefit, and even younger than us, of science and medical development, which all points to life in the womb. We know it's human. We know it's alive. That's something 95% of biologists agree on now in the scientific community. So it's really, at that point, a moral question from there. And I think everybody looks at this truth and this science and what we know about little children in the womb and their heartbeats and their fingerprints and their DNA. And it's pretty difficult to justify abortion when you know all of that.
Let's, if we can, put your legal hat on for just a minute and point out the fact that you are, of course, the Texas State Director of Human Coalition. We have information about that. And before we're done, I do want you to go into a little more detail of what it is. But right now in the state of Texas, you have a heartbeat law. Now, you've seen in the past all sorts of heartbeat bills that all get set aside, injunctions issued and things of that nature. They're declared unconstitutional. But there's a unique aspect of this heartbeat bill that has now become a heartbeat law. And as much as those who have been trying to set it aside or have it declared unconstitutional or issue an injunction or something haven't been able to do so, can you explain why Texas has been unique in actually being able to protect life and why we have so many of those pregnancy resource centers in Texas right now that are seeing an increased demand and client load among those abortion-minded women?
Yes, Kerby, I love explaining this one because it's so interesting for anyone, even non-legal minds, because if you think about it, for 49 years now, states have tried and failed to meaningfully regulate abortion. You know, they can add waiting periods, they can add certain, hospital restrictions and making sure they're safe environments. But other than that, you know, abortion has been rampant. 62 million children have died because of abortion, and Texas was the first state to do it. And so all Texas did was take laws that have been on the books forever and utilize them in the abortion context. So they said, okay, state government is not allowed to enforce this law. And because no government official can enforce a law, there's no constitutional right violation. Only the government can violate your constitutional rights. And furthermore, there's no government action to enjoin. They can't stop this law from the front end, which is what abortion providers have done for decades. They have to play now by the rules of everybody else, wait to be sued, and then they can assert their rights defensively. I think another great example would be all these SOGI ordinances where, you know, nonprofit charities don't know if and when they're going to be sued by LGBT groups, but they have to assert all their rights defensively when they are. And so all this did was make it an even playing field with abortion providers. And because of the way it was drafted, it worked, it's enforced, and thousands of lives are saved every month in Texas.
Just incredible. And again, if people want to know a little bit more, we have all sorts of links that I would encourage people to take advantage of. Again, so often when you're the host, you can't necessarily also talk about all the Human Coalition connection, but we have a link to humancoalition.org. There's a way in which you can give the gift of life. You can find out a little bit more about the individuals that have indeed been saved through these pregnancy centers, but also how abortion still is legal in this country, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, we have that link for you to follow. But let's, after we take the break, do two things. Number one, I want to hear from Chelsey about the future of a Supreme Court decision. Of course, we've been talking about the Supreme Court because you have Stephen Breyer, who is stepping down, and the possibility of Ketanji Brown Jackson replacing him maybe in the future. But this decision will come down through him and through the other justices already sitting on the court. So what's going to happen with Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organizations? We'll talk about that. But also, I'd like to open up the phones again. Perhaps you would like to join the conversation. Maybe you have a comment about the March for Life. Maybe you've been to it, or maybe you have some comments about abortion or your pregnancy resource center. Feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. As we go to a break, you might go to our website, pointofview.net, or you can go directly to humancoalition.org. All of it available, and we'll be back with Chelsey right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In previous commentaries, I've quoted Dennis Prager's assessment that the left ruins just about every part of society it touches. The latest example comes from an editorial by Derek Hunter of how political correctness is ruining the film industry. The example he cited was the decision by Hollywood to make a movie about the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The producers were able to secure Helen Mirren to play the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. This was a key component to the project since there might not be much interest in this story with the public, but getting Mirren on the project will probably increase interest and put more people in movie seats. There's just one problem. Helen Mirren isn't Jewish. For most of us, having a person who isn't Jewish play a Jewish person isn't a problem. As one of the guests on my radio program put it, it's called acting. In his commentary, Derek Hunter reminds us of another controversy in Hollywood. That one surfaced when it was announced that Scarlett Johansson would be playing a trans person in an upcoming movie. When the criticism came from the trans community, she dropped out of the project and the movie was scrapped. The publicity image for the film showed Helen Mirren in prosthetics that made her look like the Israeli politician. Derek Hunter then asked, are prosthetics not allowed anymore? Should Gary Oldman not have played Winston Churchill because he's not bald and obese? This led to an interesting discussion on my radio program about what would no longer be allowed in Hollywood. Perhaps the funniest line was that if you use the latest politically correct criteria, then Leonard Nimoy couldn't even be allowed to play Spock in Star Trek because he wasn't a Vulcan. I guess we need to laugh because the reality of all this is so tragic. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about abortion, pro-life, and the March for Life. Chelsey Youman with us. And Chelsey, just before we get into the legal issues for just a minute, let me put on your media hat for just a minute. I'm holding up our booklet on media bias because one of the callers wanted to know if you could explain, and I think I can because we talk about this in the booklet on media bias, also, of course, the one on abortion, and those are available for our listeners. Why is it that when you have this many people show up for the March for Life every single year, it is not covered by the major news outlets? And my first argument is that, first of all, there's a bias, and it is a bias that has been well documented all the way back to the Lichter-Rothman reports, in which they interviewed the media elite and came to the conclusion that the media elite was not only liberal and secular, but very humanistic and very pro-abortion. And so either the reporter or the editor, usually both, do not even see something like the March for Life as relevant, and yet it is huge. And anybody that's ever looked at one of the videos of the March for Life, sometimes they now do stop action so you can see the entire marching through faster than the actual time it takes place. You realize this is a mass of humanity, and for the press to ignore it is really journalistic malpractice. But what are your thoughts?
Kerby, you said it so well, as you always do. I think there were some press there covering, for us, for one, we had, New York Times, we know, was there in the crowd. We saw some CNN. We did see, I think Time magazine was there that I interviewed with, but they don't show what you're saying, which is the masses, and they don't cover it well. And I think there is something to the statement, the silent majority, and I think it keeps conservatives and Christians, certainly those who are pro-life, feeling siloed and alone, like maybe they're the odd man out here, but that's not the truth at all. There is a massive amount of people who are on our side, and it's so encouraging to be among them for the march. But the media does not ever do this issue justice. You know, I've done an incredible amount of media, especially since September with the Texas Heartbeat Act being successfully enacted. And they will never talk about the humanity of the child in the womb. They will never talk about the fact that it is a life. They also don't really want to cover all of the extensive services that are available to pregnant women seeking abortion. You know, they get their talking point and leave. And it's been really difficult, even just personally being in this movement. You want truth to rise out to the surface. You want others to hear your side, but you're constantly having your quotes, you know, minimalized to like the least amount of damage for their side. And that's what we have to work with. So we're going to keep doing our job. But it is always good for the listeners to know how many people view life the way you do, value it the way you do, and are fighting for it.
Again, I encourage people to listen to Point of View, because sometimes you say, am I crazy or what? And then you listen to Point of View and go, okay, really, that represents the majority. And a quote that I need to probably put in one of the booklets from Peter Berger, who's kind of a social theorist. He actually uses a very good illustration, but to understand it, you have to realize that if you look at all the nations of the world, the most religious nation is oftentimes seen as India, although the United States is in that category. The least religious, so most secular, would be Sweden. And he says, if you look at America, it's a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. And what he means by that is that if you go to the university, you would think there aren't very many individuals that are Christians, not very many individuals that believe in traditional values, not very many people that believe in conservative ideas. If you turn on ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, again, you think, oh, my goodness, I'm just in a minority. Then you go out into the hinterland, as you and I have done, and go and meet all the people and realize that this nation is much more pro-life than you would be led to believe by watching the media. And I think, if nothing else, we've answered this particular caller's question. Why is it they don't cover the March for Life? Well, they don't see it as significant. Also, they don't want to give it too much press, because if people really realized how pro-life the American people were, they would realize why now we're going to be talking about the overturning of Roe versus Wade through Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization is possible. I know it's a little bit risky to try to evaluate from just the oral arguments, but what are your thoughts about what the Supreme Court might rule on in terms of this particular case come June? Can you give us some ideas?
Yes. Well, this case, as you mentioned, is such a historic case. It's the first time that the Supreme Court has been asked to overrule Roe in 30 years. It's since Casey versus Planned Parenthood. So truly a historic moment, one I know everybody is waiting for. We are certainly waiting for. But based on oral arguments, you know, our legal community has kind of a consensus in what they think will happen. They think there are 5 votes for outright overturning Roe and returning the issue of abortion back to the states. That is as much of a win as we could ask for. You know, most of the legal community understands there's not a huge middle ground here. You either overturn Roe or leave it in place. But there's not much of a middle ground legally they can do from an originalist standpoint that would be constitutional in their decision-making. One justice, Justice Roberts, of course, who is the Chief Justice, during oral arguments seemed to be interested in tinkering with the standards. So keeping one of the standards in place, the undue burden standard, but getting rid of the viability standard as an arbitrary line in the sand. Because why would a human be protected 2 days before viability and not 2 days later? It's an arbitrary line. None of the other justices seem to agree with him, at least in oral arguments on that. And then, of course, we have the 3 liberal justices who are just actually seemed completely downtrodden and like they'd already lost. So there is a lot of hope right now. There's a lot of confidence in the movement. I would say many people, maybe even you listening, thought that this issue was done. It could never be finished. I have so many people who've said, oh, you know, abortion will never be ended. There's nowhere this movement is ever really going to go and make a change, even a few years ago. But I can say very hopefully and confidently now that we're looking at a really different abortion landscape this year.
Well, again, we'll be talking about that in June, and we'll keep speculating, but we know where the votes against it. We've, of course, talked about Stephen Breyer, Lena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor, so we're only looking at the other 6, and I think you gave us a pretty good look there as well. Just before I let you go, because I know you are a busy woman with kids and a career and all sorts of activities, let's at least do a favor to your organization, because I think so highly of a humancoalition.org. You can go to that website. And I've said on this program many times before that if you're against something, it also means you're for something. So he said, well, I'm against abortion. Okay, well, that means you need to be for something. And I would encourage you to support your local pregnancy resource center. I would encourage you to actually support your local pro-life group. But another way to do this is to actually use the resources you have there at the Human Coalition, in which you are actually reaching out and finding abortion-minded women even before they think about going to the clinic. Can you explain?
Yes, we view our organization as what hopefully the future of care for women seeking abortion will look like. So, women, when they find out they're pregnant, Google, pregnancy test, or where can I get a sonogram, or where can I get an abortion? And our marketing ads come up, and to click through our number and be immediately in touch with a licensed professional on the phone, a social worker, a nurse, or a counselor, who says, hey, why are you getting an abortion? We'll give you a free abortion consultation, tell you the truth about the medical procedure that it is, but ask, how can we help you? Why are you seeking an abortion, and what can we do to alleviate those circumstances? And 76% of our clients say, women seeking abortion say, I would prefer to parent if my life was different. And so we try to make it different and make it a holistic, caring environment for her to raise a child in. We'll walk with women for years if need be. And once we get her in the door, we'll plug her into, community resources, public and private help and assistance. But it's really driven by her and whatever she needs. And we're really proud of the work we do to serve women.
Well, and again, I see this as very valuable because we're seeing more and more women seeking chemical abortions, getting Plan B or something through the mail. And so it used to be that we could catch these women before they go to a pregnancy center or even before they go to an abortion center or whatever. Now, sometimes it's done in the privacy of their home. And this is why I think you've got such a great opportunity to make a difference. And believe me, if Roe versus Wade is overturned, you're going to have a lot of abortion-minded women that might pause long enough to say, I need to get some more information, and that's where they can get it from you. And so, Chelsey, I appreciate the stand that you were taking. I appreciate the work that you're doing with the Human Coalition, and I would encourage you to click on that button to find out more about that organization and to join with it. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Well, again, when we come back from the break, we're going to spend some time getting into a couple of issues in the news. One of those has to do with Ukraine, and also a couple of little odds and ends that I have here. We learned a little bit more about the influence of China. We've learned a little bit more about actually what Denmark is going to do on the issue of COVID and a number of other topics. So let's take a break. We will come back with a little bit more in this last half hour right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, of course, open line 1-800-351-1212. Did want to cover a couple of issues. Our second article is entitled Ukraine and Taiwan. It is really just a short summary of some of the things that the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, had to say. And I know from time to time, some of you like to take some notes. And if you do, you might number 1 to 4, because I think you can kind of summarize his piece in 4 points. points, and all of them are relevant. I may have a slight disagreement with one or two, but mostly I agree with them, and that's why we posted it, because it helps you understand that right now, as he starts out by talking about, the United States is confronting a pair of ruthless dictatorships in two potential collisions that could change history and leave Americans at enormous risk. Now, first of all, he used to be a history professor, so yes, sometimes politicians engage in a little by hyperbole, but I think that's pretty much on target. And we've talked about the fact that we really are dealing with two very different countries, but two countries that might even be planning to do this simultaneously, because there's no way the United States could or would be able to fight a two-front war. First of all, I don't think we should be fighting a war, but that's a point that we can make in just a minute. So if we want to prevent it, on your notes, number one, sanctions. Because the point that is being made right now by the president, that would be Joe Biden, and by Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, is that there would be severe sanctions if Russia invaded Ukraine. But the reality is they probably would not have an effect. This is the third paragraph, if you'd like to read it in its entirety, but the argument by Newt Gingrich really is twofold. Number one, when you had Russia seize Crimea, that happened during the Obama administration, or you might call it the Obama-Biden administration, because Joe Biden was the vice president at the time, and they actually threatened severe economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, when Russia did that in Crimea. And what was the impact? Didn't seem to hurt Russia at all. So if you think that, number one, the president or the dictator or the leader, whatever you want to call Vladimir Putin of Russia, is shaking in his boots over the threat of sanctions, guess again. The second point is also very relevant that Newt Gingrich makes. Number one, the sanctions didn't seem to hurt last time. What reasonable expectation do we have that they would hurt this time? But the second point that he makes is when Biden's war on American energy, he says, raised the price of oil, it then forced President Biden to beg Russia and Saudi Arabia to increase production to lower the price of oil. And so, again, you can kind of see the irony, he calls it the absurdity, of on one hand talking about the actions compared to the words. So, again, the first point, if you make your 4 points on your little notes, sanctions, are sanctions going to work? Hate to tell you, don't think they will. Which leads to number two, and that is the issue of oil. Because oil, as Newt Gingrich points out, is the largest source of foreign income to Russia. Every dollar per barrel increase is a windfall to Vladimir Putin, and it means that it's more money in the coffers of Russia to spend on Russian military and other foreign adventures. Let's go back to October 2020. Now, we were in the midst of the pandemic and the lockdown. Remember this, October 2020? But at that time, due to the actions of President Donald Trump, the price of crude oil was $39.90, so almost $40 a barrel, $39.90. Today, at least if you look at the last price of crude, it's at $85.43. So we went from 40 to 85 in round numbers, and you can see that, again, oil, if anything, is allowing Russia to actually do the kinds of things that Russia would want to do. If indeed Russia was trying to sell oil and nobody was buying it, you can see how that would be a significant strain on Russia. But again, sanctions, threats, they probably mean very little to Vladimir Putin. So, number one, sanctions. Number two, oil. Number three, is this possibly a distraction? And Newt Gingrich puts it this way. Far from being intimidated, the Russians have announced that they will be holding military maneuvers off Ireland. Did anybody see that coming? I didn't. That country has complained and said it doesn't want Russian warships in their neighborhood. But since Ireland is not a member of NATO, which I had not really remembered, and its own forces are totally inadequate to dealing with Russia. NATO would have to be involved if there was a serious incident. So first of all, you could have a situation in which NATO, which supposedly is focused on the eastern border of Ukraine, where the Russian military is on the other side of the border, have to divert some of its attention to, of all places, Ireland. Didn't see that one coming. But the bigger issue, and that comes back to the reason why I called this Ukraine and Taiwan. Meanwhile, while Vladimir Putin is keeping everyone focused on Ukraine, Xi Jinping, who is the leader, the dictator of China and the Chinese Communist Party, is busy putting pressure on Taiwan. Just the other day, the Chinese communists flew 39 aircraft, including a nuclear bomber near Taiwan. So, number one, sanctions. Number two, oil. Number three, distractions. And number four, where are our allies? Now, yesterday, you might remember, I went through the list that Gary Bauer provided for us, but I think it's reasonable to summarize it by simply saying that one of the more powerful countries in NATO would be Germany. And yet Biden, that is President Biden, he says, has had a difficult time communicating with his allies and has had no impact at all on Germany, which, as Newt Gingrich puts it, is now choosing Russian natural gas over NATO. And so Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are talking regularly and may even be coordinating activities. So the point he's making is that when you project weakness, you get any kind of invitation for action. And he reminds us of the fact that he was watching this movie with his wife, Callista, Munich, the Edge of War, in which it was reminding us, and of course he's a historian, so he knows this only so well, but let's remind all of us of the meeting in Munich between Adolf Hitler and the British Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, in which Chamberlain essentially gave away Czechoslovakia in order to buy for what he called peace for our time. And interestingly enough, before Munich and a radio broadcast to the British people, Neville Chamberlain had described the German-Czechoslovakian crisis as a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. On learning that Chamberlain had actually sold out this free country of Czechoslovakia, leaving it defenseless against the German dictatorship, you might remember Winston Churchill warned, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war," because as we have learned so often, weakness when facing dictators is dangerous, and the situations, Newt Gingrich says, in Ukraine and Taiwan are both dangerous, and they present a dual challenge. So anyway, it's a second article, but I wanted to break it down so that if you read through that, the four key points that I made surface at various parts in the discussion, tried to summarize them in an easy way possible. And while we're talking about China, there is a new book out by Peter Schweitzer. He's been on the program with us before and has talked about, for example, how people like Nancy Pelosi and even before that, Republican members of the House and speakers have all made so much money. But his latest book is called Red-Handed, How American Elites Get Rich Helping China Win. And the article and the book now goes into how, in some cases, this Chinese company, Huawei, it's Huawei, I guess is how you pronounce that, actually paid an individual, Tony Podesta, $1 million to lobby the Biden administration on trade issues. And Gary Bauer says that if the name Podesta sounds familiar, he's the brother of John Podesta, who was Bill Clinton's White House chief of staff, also the top Obama White House advisor, and was the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton. So this new book, which is out, I'm going to take the time to read it, and I'm sure we'll have a chance in the future to interview him. He's an equal opportunity grief giver. He's pointed out how both Republicans and Democrats in the House and even presidents have been able to benefit sometimes by selling access, and here $1 million just to one individual alone to lobby the Biden administration on China. And we wonder why people never speak out against what's happening in China. Well, maybe there's just so much money being washed around and put in the hands of individuals. That's why it's really hard for them to make any kind of moral reflection on some of the human rights abuses. Anyway, let's take a break. We have more to cover, and I will do that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that tomorrow it is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. It may take a whole hour to talk about all the things happening right now at First Liberty. They have two cases before the Supreme Court. They have a decision coming down in another case. They've won another particular action, and they've expanded the suit that they had with the Navy SEALs to a huge class action suit. Of course, you might have a few comments to make about Stephen Breyer and the future of the Supreme Court. So it'll probably take a while, but I think you will really enjoy the conversation. Glad that you'll be in studio with us, and we'll talk about that then. Well, we haven't said anything about COVID, so I thought I'd say two things real quickly. Number one, you might remember the other day where I talked about the largest newspaper in Denmark said, we apologize, we probably didn't do as much of an evaluation of some of the statements coming down. Well, on the heels of that, you now have the prime minister of the entire country, Denmark, announcing that Denmark would be throwing out most of its COVID-19 pandemic restrictions, including the mask mandates. So, come February 1st, that's next week, the restrictions will change and masks will only be required in hospitals, healthcare facilities, and homes for the elderly. And so it's kind of interesting to see all of this as well. And so we'll see what that plans and how that ends up. But it's kind of interesting to see as you look at some of these other Western countries, they're beginning to rethink some of the regulations and the restrictions that they've had in the past. While I'm talking about COVID, the other day on Fox News, and in particular, it was I think it was Tuesday night edition, a special report with Brett Baier. They did some kind of real journalism. You know, the investigative journalism that we've talked about in the past that hardly ever takes place? Well, this is the case. And they actually went back to what we called the COVID origin story. Now, I've seen some of this in articles, but they actually covered it and pointed out in their piece, and I'm sure the video's available. Matter of fact, I suspect it'll be easy to find on YouTube. They point out in the early days of the pandemic, first Dr. Anthony Fauci, and then Dr. Francis Collins, both were concerned about the idea that people were promoting that the COVID pandemic may have come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, of course, Dr. Anthony Fauci, you know, Dr. Francis Collins, former head of the National Institute of Health, and so they called an emergency meeting. And multiple scientists said that in that meeting that they believed that the natural occurrence explanation for COVID-19 was unlikely, and it looked very much like this virus was genetically engineered in a laboratory and actually possibly is the most likely explanation. Well, then the study, and I've seen enough evidence now of other people writing about this, show that both Anthony Fauci and Collins were determined to shut down any kind of discussion of this lab leak theory. And so Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci did so. Francis Collins was very insistent. Matter of fact, at one point he said that any discussion of a Wuhan lab leak could do great potential harm to science and international harmony. Gary Bauer, in a piece that he had come out the other day, said, what does international harmony have to do with this, given the fact that the communist Chinese oftentimes routinely damage international harmony? But nevertheless, we have always appreciated Francis Collins because he is a Christian. He's maybe believed in theistic evolution. There have been some places where we'd obviously maybe disagree with him on some of the things he teaches, but nevertheless, you know, has stepped down, and we now are learning a lot more about some of the collusion between certainly Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. And 3 cheers for Fox News being willing to cover what most of the mainstream media will ignore. Just before I take a break, let me just mention that the other day we had our good friend, Dr. Merrill Matthews here, in which he was talking about the fact that in the future with these elections, this red wave could turn into a red tsunami. Well, he's not the only one talking about this. Byron York, who is the chief political correspondent for Washington Examiner, makes the same statement, almost uses the same phraseology. But he points out again that when you look at the latest Pew Research polls, it shows Joe Biden at the lowest approval rating that you can possibly imagine, and then reminds us, as we've talked about before, that usually historically, that the president's party loses a number of seats during the first midterm election. And reminds us that, for example, when Bill Clinton was in office after 2 years, his ratings was about 46%, which is still better than Joe Biden is right now. And nevertheless, his party lost 53 seats in the House. Barack Obama's approval rating in 2010 was, again, higher than Joe Biden's right now, and his party lost 63 seats. And to put it in perspective more recently, Donald Trump in 2018, his approval rating was kind of where Biden's is right now, and his party lost 41 seats. So you can begin to see that this is why some people looking at all of this have said this could really be a remarkable change in both the House and the Senate. And so we'll continue to watch that. Some of you might say, well, isn't it a little premature? Well, I'll tell you, Monday is the last day for at least those of us in the state of Texas to register to vote in the primary, because early voting in the primary will take place on Valentine's Day. And if you look on the calendar, you'll see that's coming up in about 2 weeks. So while many of you don't have a primary election till May or June, July, or August, in Texas, we'll be having it really fairly soon, and it's an illustration again of why we need to start paying attention to the election, and we'll continue talking about it. But I thought we would end by reminding you that I think the best answer to misinformation or bad information is more information. But apparently the singer Neil Young has not thought so, and Neil Young made it very clear the other day to Spotify that either you can have Neil Young's records and various recordings on Spotify, or you have to get rid of Joe Rogan. And again, it's kind of interesting because one is kind of music, one is podcast. And so you can have Rogan or you can have Young, not both. Well, Spotify didn't wait very long, and they said, okay, goodbye, Neil Young, the singer of Heart of Gold and Harvest Moon and others simply said, you only can have one or the other, and they said goodbye. And now he's actually writing another piece in which he's encouraging other artists to pull off of Spotify. And I don't care if you're a liberal or conservative, I've always said that this idea of cancel culture, or this idea that I never want to be on a particular place where something I would disagree with is there. And is it possible that you've heard some things that Joe Rogan has said you don't agree with? Yeah, but is that reason to pull your music off? I don't know, but that's at least the case. And so if you want to now listen to any of Neil Young's music, I guess you're going to have to borrow the vinyls from Steve Miller here. He'd be glad to provide those for you. By the way, for you young people, a vinyl is a record. It's kind of like a CD. It's only bigger. I'm kidding, Heffley. And you play them on these things called phonographs. You maybe saw one in a museum. Although it's interesting, we're kind of coming back to vinyl records again. So if you want to borrow any of his Neil Young albums, I guess you could borrow them from him. He's giving me the thumbs up. But I still thought at least we'd acknowledge it. Neil Young's music no longer on Spotify. We'll see if others follow suit. I hope not, because we believe that as many good ideas can be out there, and good ideas actually dismiss bad ideas. And let's use logic and let's use good arguments to make our case. Anyway, we're out of time for today. Tomorrow will be, of course, our weekend edition. As always, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.